The silence where it all began. The room was cold when it happened, a sterile chill seeping through the thin gown they draped over me, the kind that clings to your skin and makes you feel smaller than you are. I lay there alone, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like some distant swarm I couldn't sweat away. My breaths came in jagged bursts, each one tearing through me as the pain built, a relentless tide I couldn't outrun. There was no one to hold my hand, no voice to murmur assurances, just the steady beep of a machine tracking a heartbeat that wasn't mine. His father was gone long before this moment, vanished into the night with his promises and his crooked smile, leaving me with nothing but a swelling belly and a rent I couldn't pay. My parents turned their backs too, their silence louder than any words they might have spared, and my siblings scattered like leaves in a storm, unwilling to be tethered to my mess. So it was just me, pushing through the hours, my body splitting open to bring him into a world that already felt too empty to hold us both. When he came, the room didn't fill with cries like I'd imagined it would. I'd pictured that sound 1,000 times, sharp, piercing, alive, proof that something good could come from all this wreckage. But there was nothing. Just a stillness that settled over us, heavy and unyielding, as the nurse lifted him, his tiny chest rising and falling, his face scrunched in a way that should have screamed but didn't. I waited, my own breath caught somewhere deep, expecting that wail to break the air, to shatter the quiet that pressed against my ears. It never came. They cleaned him, wrapped him in a blanket too stiff for his fragile frame, and placed him in my arms, his weight so slight it barely registered against the ache in my bones. I stared at him, this little stranger I'd made, his eyes blinking up at me, dark and searching, and I wondered why he didn't cry, why the room stayed so hollow. The nurse said something about rest, her lips moving in a blur I couldn't follow, and then she was gone, leaving me with him, the two of us adrift in a silence I didn't yet understand. Months crept by, slow and gray, each day blending into the next like damp pages in a book no one would read. I'd cradle him in the dim light of our one-room apartment, the wall stained with years of neglect, the carpet threadbare under my feet. I'd rock him, my arms trembling from the weight of it all, and I'd hum soft, tuneless sounds I thought might soothe him, might weave some thread of comfort between us. He'd lie there, his small hands curling against my chest, his gaze drifting past me to the ceiling, and I'd watch him, waiting for something, anything, to tell me he knew I was there. But he didn't flinch when the neighbor's dog barked through the thin walls, didn't stir when a car horn blared outside, didn't turn when I called his name, Samuel, over and over, my voice cracking as it fell into the void. At first I told myself it was nothing, that babies were just quiet sometimes, that he'd grow into the noise of the world like I had. But the doubt gnawed at me, a persistent ache that kept me awake while he slept, his breath so faint I'd press my hand to his chest to be sure he was still alive. I took him to the clinic when he was 6 months old. A squat building with peeling paint and a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. The doctor was a tired man with gray hair and hands that moved too quickly, his stethoscope cold against Samuel's skin. I sat there, my fingers twisting the frayed strap of my bag, watching as he flashed lights and clapped near Samuel's ears, each test stretching the silence thinner until it snapped. The diagnosis came in words I didn't want to hear: profound deafness. They called it a permanent severing from the world I'd known. He handed me a stack of papers, test results in black ink that blurred as my eyes burned, and I nodded, not because I understood, but because there was nothing else to do. I walked out, Samuel strapped to my chest, his warmth the only thing keeping me from dissolving into the pavement. We stood by the hospital window, the glass streaked with rain, and I looked out at the city moving on without us, cars rushing, people shouting, a symphony of sound he'd never know. The weight of it settled into me then, a realization as stark as the overcast sky. My life, our life, would never be what I'd dreamed. It would be quieter, harder, a path carved through a silence I couldn't escape. I didn't cry that day, not there, not with him in my arms and the world pressing in from all sides. I held the papers tighter, their edges cutting into my palms, and I thought about how I'd carried him alone, birthed him alone, and now I'd raise him alone in a way I hadn't foreseen. The nurses had offered pamphlets, support groups, a list of things I could do, but I didn't want their pity or their plans. I wanted answers, a way to fix what I couldn't even name. Back home, I laid him in his crib, a second-hand thing that creaked under his slight frame, and I stood over him, watching his chest rise and fall, a rhythm that mocked the chaos in my head. The silence wasn't just his now, it was mine too, wrapping around us like a shroud, and as I leaned against the wall, my legs giving way beneath me, I wondered how I'd carry us through a life that already felt so heavy, so still, so utterly alone. A locked world. Time slipped through my fingers like sand I couldn't hold, years piling up in a haze of muted mornings and endless nights, each one blurring into the next until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Samuel grew, his body stretching out from the fragile infant I'd once cradled, his limbs lengthening, his face sharpening into something I barely recognized, less mine with every passing day. The apartment stayed the same, though its walls still stained, its floors still worn, a box that trapped us both in a life that felt too small to contain his silence. I'd watch him from the corner of my eye as I stirred pots of watery soup or scrubbed dishes that never seemed clean, my hands moving through the motions while my mind drifted, tethered only by the sight of him sitting there, always apart, always staring out at a world he couldn't hear. The playground was just beyond our window, a patch of cracked asphalt and rusted swings where other children shrieked and chased each other, their voices rising like a tide that crashed against our stillness. He'd perch on the edge of the sill, his knees drawn up, his small hands pressed to the glass, and I'd see his eyes follow them, darting, curious, lost, not because he wanted to join, but because he couldn't understand why they moved the way they did. Why their mouths opened and closed in patterns he'd never deciphered. I taught myself the signs when he was 3, my fingers fumbling through books I'd borrowed from the library, their pages yellowed and dog-eared, the ink smudged from too many desperate hands before mine. I'd sit him on my lap, his body stiff against me, and I'd shape the words hello, eat, play, my hands trembling as I tried to bridge the gap between us. He'd mimic me sometimes, his movements slow and uncertain, but more often he'd turn away, his gaze drifting back to that window, to the lives unfolding outside that seemed so much brighter than ours. I'd read him stories too, my voice filling the room with tales of dragons and far-off lands, the kind I'd loved as a girl, hoping the rhythm might reach him even if the sound couldn't. But his eyes stayed blank, fixed on the pictures or the ceiling, and I'd falter, my throat tightening as I realized he'd never hear the rise and fall of my words, never feel the magic I tried to weave. The silence wasn't just his anymore, it had seeped into me, a weight that pressed down harder each time I saw him slip further into a place I couldn't follow. The other mothers at the park didn't look at me. Their chatter a distant hum as they clustered near the benches, their children tumbling over each other in a chaos of noise I'd once taken for granted. I'd bring Samuel there some days, my steps heavy with a hope I couldn't shake, thinking maybe he'd find a way to fit among them, to belong in a way I never had. But he'd sit alone, always on the edge by the slide, under the tree, his hands tracing patterns in the dirt while their laughter rang out, sharp and unreachable. Once, a boy ran too close, his shout slicing through the air, and I tensed, waiting for Samuel to flinch, to turn, to react. He didn't. The boy darted away, and Samuel kept drawing, his fingers carving lines I couldn't read, his world locked tight behind a wall I couldn't climb. I'd stand there, my arms crossed against the chill, watching him watch them, and I'd feel the ache grow, a hollow thing that spread from my chest to my fingertips, a longing for him to know what I couldn't give him. Nights were the hardest. When the city quieted and the apartment filled with a stillness that wasn't peace but something heavier, something that clung to the shadows and made the air thick. He'd sleep in his corner, the mattress sagging under his growing frame, and I'd lie awake on the couch, my eyes tracing cracks in the ceiling while my mind replayed every moment I might have missed, every sign I'd ignored, every chance I'd lost to pull him closer. I'd started leaving the radio on low, a soft drone of voices and static, not for him but for me, a tether to a world that still spoke, that still moved beyond our locked doors. But even that felt futile, the sound swallowed by the vastness of his silence, and I'd turn it off, my hand lingering on the dial as if I could twist it back to a time when things were different, when I wasn't so alone in this fight to reach him. He was 6 now. His hair darker, his shoulders broader, but his eyes carried the same distance, the same quiet I'd seen that first day in the hospital. I'd catch him standing by the window more often, his back to me, his head tilted as he studied the street below, cars rolling by, people walking with purpose, dogs barking at nothing. I wondered what he saw in it all, what he made of a life he couldn't hear, whether he felt the same emptiness I did or something else entirely. I'd sign to him, dinner, come, look, and he'd nod, a faint jerk of his head, but there was no warmth in it, no connection, just emotion he'd learned to make me stop. I kept trying, my hands shaping words he barely acknowledged, my days spent chasing a bond that slipped further away with every year. The playground faded from his view as he grew, replaced by the flicker of lights outside, the movement of shadows he couldn't name, and I'd stand behind him, unseen, my reflection faint in the glass, wondering how long I could keep reaching for a son whose world was locked so tight I'd never find the key. The weight of loneliness, the days stretched into a rhythm so predictable it carved itself into my bones, a cycle of waking, moving, waiting, and fading that left no room for anything else, no space for the life I'd once imagined might bloom beyond these walls. Mornings began before the sun breached the horizon, the sky outside still bruised with night, its gray seeping through the curtains I hadn't replaced in years. I'd rise from the couch, my back stiff from the springs that poked through the thin cushion, my body protesting every shift as I shuffled to Samuel's corner, where he slept curled under a blanket too small for his growing frame. I'd stand over him, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, the only sound in a room that swallowed everything else, and I'd nudge him awake with a gentle shake, my hand lingering on his shoulder longer than it needed to. As if that touch could pull him into my world, could make him feel me there. His eyes would open, dark and distant, and he'd sit up without a sound, his movements mechanical, like a puppet I'd wound too tight, and I'd turn away, my throat thick with something I couldn't name, to start the routine that held us together. The kitchen was a narrow strip of chipped linoleum and a stove that hissed more than it heated, its burners flickering weakly as I boiled water for oatmeal, the same gray mush we'd eaten for years because it was cheap and filled the hollow in our stomachs. I'd stir it, my wrist aching from the repetition, my mind drifting to the nights I'd once cooked for myself, spices, colors, flavors I couldn't afford now, before Samuel, before the silence that drained everything bright from my life. I'd set the bowl in front of him, his hands reaching for the spoon without looking at me, and I'd watch him eat, his head bowed, his focus locked on the table as if I weren't there at all. I'd sign school, hurry, good, and he'd nod, a faint tilt of his chin, but his eyes never met mine, never lingered long enough to see the exhaustion etched into my face, the lines that deepened with every year I carried us alone. I'd pack his lunch, a sandwich on bread that was always a day too old, and I'd walk him to the bus stop, the cold biting at my fingers as I waved him off, the yellow blur of the school bus vanishing into the mist, leaving me standing there. My breath fogging in the air, my body already heavy with the hours ahead. Work was a warehouse on the edge of town, a sprawling concrete tomb where the air smelled of dust and oil, where the hum of machinery drowned out the thoughts I didn't want to face. I'd clock in, my hands moving over boxes, stacking, sorting, lifting until my shoulders burned and my knees trembled, the weight of each load a mirror to the one I carried inside. The hours bled together, 8 stretching to 10 when the supervisor barked for overtime, and I'd nod, my head low, because the extra dollars meant another month of rent, another week of food, another day we wouldn't sink. My coworkers kept their distance, their voices a dull roar I couldn't join, their laughter a language I'd forgotten how to speak. I'd catch their glances sometimes, pity, maybe, or indifference, and I'd turn away, my fingers tightening around the tape gun, my mind replaying the years that brought me here, the choices I hadn't made, the life I'd lost when Samuel's silence became mine. By the time the shift ended, night had fallen, the sky a deep void pressing down on the city, and I'd trudge home, my boots scuffing the pavement, my body a shell that moved only because it had to. Evenings were ours, or they should have been, but they felt like another chore. Another stretch of time to fill with something that might mean something to him. I'd find him at the table when I got back, his school bag slumped by the door, his notebooks open, his pencil scratching lines I couldn't always read. I'd sit across from him, my hand signing questions, how was school, what did you learn, are you okay, my fingers stiff from the cold, my gestures clumsy from the years of trying. He'd respond sometimes, a quick flick of his hands, fine, math, yes, but it was rote, a habit more than a bridge, and I'd watch him turn back to his work, his focus shutting me out as surely as the silence did. I'd try to tell him about my day, my hands shaping words about the warehouse, the boxes, the ache in my back, hoping he'd look up, hoping he'd see me, but his eyes stayed down, his world a fortress I couldn't breach. The apartment was bare around us, the walls empty of pictures, the shelves holding only what we needed, plates, a kettle, a clock that ticked too loudly in a space that didn't need it. I'd stopped buying things long ago, stopped dreaming of a home that felt alive, because every dime went to him, to us, to keeping this fragile thread from snapping. We didn't go out much, not anymore, not after the stares became too heavy, the whispers too sharp. Even if he couldn't hear them. I tried once, years back, taking him to a fair, the lights, the crowds, the music I thought he might feel in his chest, but he'd stood there, rigid, his hands clenched, his eyes darting to faces that turned away when I signed to him. People stepped back, their curiosity souring to discomfort, and I'd felt it too, the way they saw us as something broken, something to avoid. I'd stopped trying after that, kept us inside where the world couldn't judge, where I could pretend we were enough. But the loneliness grew, a weight that settled into every corner of this place, every breath I took, every glance he didn't return. I'd lie awake after he slept, my body sinking into the couch, my eyes tracing the same cracks in the ceiling, and I'd wonder how long I could keep this up, how long I could carry us both through a life that felt like a shadow of what it should have been, a life where the silence wasn't just his but ours, a burden I couldn't put down. The wall between us, the years had a way of piling up unnoticed, stacking themselves into a tower I couldn't climb down from, each one adding another layer to the distance that had crept between Samuel and me, A gap I felt more than I could see. A chasm carved by time and silence I didn't know how to cross. He was 12 now, his frame taller, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him seem older than he was, his face hardening into angles I didn't recognize, as if the boy I'd carried through those first quiet years had slipped away, leaving someone else in his place. The apartment hadn't changed, though. Its walls still bore the same stains, its floors still groaned under every step, its air still thick with a stillness that pressed against my chest until I couldn't breathe. I'd wake each morning to the same gray light filtering through the curtains, my body aching from the couch I'd never replaced, and I'd find him already up, sitting at the table or staring out that window, his back to me, his presence a shadow I couldn't reach. I'd sign to him, "Good morning, breakfast, school," and he'd nod, a curt jerk of his head, but his eyes wouldn't lift, wouldn't meet mine, and I'd feel that nod like a door closing, a barrier rising higher with every day that passed. His silence had always been there. A constant I'd learned to live with, but now it felt different, heavier, laced with something I couldn't name, resentment, maybe, or a loneliness that mirrored my own but turned inward, away from me. I'd watch him move through the apartment, his steps quick and deliberate, his hands tucked into his pockets or clutching a pencil as he scratched out homework I no longer understood, and I'd see how he avoided me, how his shoulders tensed when I came too close, how his gaze slid past me like I was part of the furniture, something to step around rather than notice. I'd try to reach him, my hands shaping words. "How was your day? What's wrong? Talk to me," my fingers trembling from the effort, from the years of hoping he'd respond with more than a shrug, more than a flick of his wrist that said nothing at all. But he'd turn away, his back a wall I couldn't scale, and I'd stand there, my arms falling limp, my chest tight with the realization that he didn't want me in his world, that I'd become a stranger in the space we shared. One afternoon, I came home from the warehouse, my hands raw from hours of lifting, my legs heavy with a fatigue that never left, and I found him gone, the apartment emptier than usual, the air colder without his presence to fill it. His school bag wasn't by the door, his notebooks weren't on the table, and I felt a pang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the dull ache I'd grown used to. I'd wait, my eyes fixed on the clock, its ticks slicing through the silence, each one stretching the minutes into hours until the sky outside darkened and the streetlights flickered on. He'd come back late, his hair mussed, his jacket slung over his shoulder, and I'd sign, "Where were you? Why didn't you tell me?" I was worried, my hands frantic, my breath catching as I tried to pull some answer from him. He'd shrug, his face blank, his hands staying still, and he'd walk past me to his corner, shutting me out as if I hadn't spent the day hauling boxes to keep us afloat, as if I hadn't spent years building a life for him out of nothing. I'd stand there, my fingers clenched, my mind racing with questions I couldn't ask, with fears I couldn't voice, and I'd wonder where he went, what he did, who he was becoming without me. I found the headphones one evening, tucked under his pillow when I went to change the sheets, a cheap pair with frayed wires and cracked plastic, the kind you'd see on kids at the bus stop, their heads bobbing to music I couldn't afford. They weren't plugged into anything, no radio, no device, just lying there, useless in a way that broke me more than I expected. I held them, my hands shaking, my eyes burning as I realized he didn't wear them to hear, couldn't wear them to hear, but kept them anyway, a prop to blend into a world that didn't want him, a mask to hide the silence he couldn't escape. I sank onto his mattress, the springs creaking under me, and I stared at those headphones, their presence a wound I couldn't bandage, a sign that he was reaching for something I couldn't give him, something beyond me, beyond us. I'd put them back, my fingers lingering on the pillow, and I'd sit there, the room darkening around me, my mind replaying every moment I'd tried to hold him close, every time I'd failed to keep him from drifting away. He stopped signing back altogether after that, his hands staying still even when I asked, even when I begged with gestures that felt more like pleas than words. "Look at me, stay, let me in." I'd catch him watching the window again, his eyes tracing the lives outside, the ones that moved and laughed and spoke in ways he never would, and I'd see a hunger there, a longing that cut deeper than my own. He'd leave after school, his steps quick as he slipped out the door, and I'd wait, my body tense, my mind spinning with images of where he might be, streets I didn't know, places I couldn't follow, people who saw him as something I didn't. He'd return in the dark, his face closed off, his hands empty of answers, and I'd feel the wall grow thicker, taller, a fortress built from years of silence I couldn't break through. I'd lie awake at night, the couch sagging beneath me, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, and I'd wonder if he blamed me, if he saw me as the reason his world was so small, if he hated me for the life I'd given him, for the mother I couldn't be. The loneliness was a weight I'd carried alone for so long, but now it was ours, split between us, and yet it drove us further apart, a burden we bore in silence, each on our own side of a wall I didn't know how to tear down. The last attempt to understand the air in the apartment had grown thicker somehow, heavier with a tension I couldn't shake, a weight that settled into every corner and clung to me like damp cloth, making each breath a little harder, each step a little slower. As if the silence itself had taken on a shape I couldn't push away. Samuel was 13 now, his body lanky and awkward, his face shadowed with a sullenness that hadn't been there before, his presence more a ghost than a boy, slipping through the rooms like smoke I couldn't grasp. I'd wake to find him already gone some mornings, the table empty, his school bag missing, and I'd stand there, my hands hovering over the stove, my mind racing with questions I'd stopped asking because they never brought answers. He'd come back late, his jacket slung over his arm, his shoes scuffed with dirt from streets I didn't know, and I'd sign, "Where were you? What happened? Are you safe?" My fingers sharp with the desperation I couldn't hide, but he'd brush past me. His eyes fixed on the floor, his hands still, his silence a blade that cut deeper every time. I'd watch him disappear into his corner, the curtain he'd hung for privacy swing slightly, and I'd feel the wall between us grow, not just taller but denser, a thing I couldn't break through no matter how hard I tried. One evening, the warehouse let me off early. The machines shutting down with a groan that echoed in my ears as I walked home, my boots heavy on the pavement, my shoulders slumped under a fatigue that never lifted. The sky was a bruise of purple and gray, the streetlights flickering on, casting long shadows that stretched ahead of me like paths I'd never take. I climbed the stairs to our floor, the railing cold under my hand, the steps creaking with every lift of my legs, and I opened the door to find the apartment dark, the quiet sharper than usual, a stillness that told me he wasn't there. I dropped my bag by the door, my fingers numb from the chill, and I moved to his corner, drawn by something I couldn't name, a pull that tugged at me like a thread I hadn't known was there. The curtain was half open, his mattress unmade, the blanket twisted into knots, and I knelt, my knees pressing into the floor, my hands reaching to smooth it out, to do something, anything, to feel connected to him again. I saw it then, tucked beneath the pillow. A corner of paper peeking out, its edge curled from being handled too much, its surface smudged with pencil marks that caught the dim light filtering through the window. I pulled it free, my breath catching as I unfolded it, my eyes tracing the lines of a notebook, its pages filled with drawings I hadn't known he made, sketches that spilled across the paper in a rush of graphite and shadow. There were scenes of the street outside, cars blurred into streaks, people walking with heads down, dogs barking silently in his world, and there was me, over and over, my figure bent, my head lowered, my hands clasped or stirring something on the stove. Always tired, always small. I turned the pages, my fingers trembling, my chest tightening as I saw him too, drawn alone, a boy in the dark, his back to me, his hands empty, his form surrounded by lines that looked like bars, like walls, like a cage he couldn't escape. The drawings were rough, jagged, but they held a truth I couldn't deny, a mirror to a life I'd built for us, a life he saw as broken, as lonely as mine. I sat back, the notebook heavy in my lap, my eyes burning with tears I hadn't let fall in years. Not since that day in the hospital when the silence first took root, not since I'd stood by that window with his diagnosis in my hands. These weren't just pictures, they were his voice, a language he'd never shared with me, a story he'd kept locked away, and they hit me harder than any words could have, harder than his shrugs, his absences, his refusal to sign back. I saw myself through his eyes, worn, defeated, a shadow of a mother who couldn't give him what he needed, and I saw him, trapped in a world I tried to make safe but had only made small, a world where I was the constant but not the comfort. Where my love was a weight he couldn't carry. I clutched the notebook, my nails digging into the paper, my mind reeling with the realization that all my years of trying, all my hours of working, all my nights of waiting, hadn't reached him, hadn't filled the void I'd left in his life. He came home later. The door creaking as he stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the floor, his face unreadable in the half-light. I was still on his mattress, the notebook open beside me, my hands resting on my knees, my body frozen in a moment I couldn't move past. He stopped, his eyes flicking to the paper, then to me, and I saw something shift in him, a flicker of surprise, maybe fear, maybe anger, but he didn't move, didn't sign, didn't give me anything to hold on to. I stood, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding as I crossed the room to him, my hands shaking as I reached out, not with words this time, not with signs, but with a touch, my palm settling on his shoulder, light but firm, a gesture I hadn't dared in months. He tensed, his muscles stiff under my fingers, and I waited, my breath held, my eyes locked on his, searching for something, anything, to tell me he felt me there. For the first time in so long he didn't pull away, didn't turn, didn't shut me out, and I stood there, my hand on him, the notebook at my feet, the silence between us softer somehow, not a wall but a thread, fragile and thin, a chance I hadn't known I still had. Acceptance. The notebook stayed with me after that night, Not in my hands but in my mind, its pages burned into me like a map I couldn't unsee, a guide to a place I'd been too afraid to go, a place where Samuel lived. Where his silence wasn't just absence but a world of its own, one I'd spent years trying to pull him out of instead of stepping into. He was still distant, his steps still quick when he left, his eyes still averted when he returned, but that moment, my hand on his shoulder, his body not pulling away, had shifted something, cracked the wall between us just enough for me to see through. To feel the weight of what I'd missed, what I'd failed to understand. I'd lain awake after he went to sleep, the couch creaking under me, the ceiling above me a blur of shadows, and I'd traced those drawings in my head, the bent shape of me, the caged shape of him, until the truth settled into me, heavy and clear. I couldn't make him like the others, couldn't force him into a life he'd never hear, but I could meet him where he was, could stop fighting the silence and start living in it with him. The warehouse had been my anchor for too long, its concrete walls and endless boxes a prison I'd chained myself to, each shift grinding me down until I was little more than dust, a shadow of the woman I'd once been, a woman who dreamed of something more before the silence took it all away. I'd go there each day, my hands moving over the same loads, my back bending under the same strain, my mind numb with the same routine, but now it felt different, hollow, a tether I no longer needed. I'd think of Samuel, of the hours I spent away from him, of the life I'd left him to navigate alone, and I'd feel the ache grow, not just in my bones but in my chest, a longing to be more than the tired figure in his sketches, more than the mother who gave everything but never enough. One morning I didn't go back. I walked past the bus stop, my boots scuffing the pavement, my breath fogging in the cold, and I kept going, my hands empty, my steps unsteady, until I reached the school for the deaf. A low brick building I'd passed 1,000 times but never entered, a place I'd avoided because it meant admitting what I couldn't change. I stood outside, the wind biting at my face, my fingers twisting the strap of my bag as I watched the students file in, their hands moving in. Patterns I recognized but didn't fully know, their faces alive with something I hadn't seen in Samuel, something I hadn't given him. I went inside, my heart pounding, my palms slick with sweat, and I found the office, my voice breaking as I asked about work, about anything that would let me stay, let me learn, let me be closer to him. They took me on, not as a teacher but as an aide, a job that paid less than the warehouse but demanded less of my body, less of my soul, a job that put me in his world instead of dragging me out of it. I'd sit in the back of classrooms, my eyes following the teacher's hands, my own fumbling to keep up, my mind racing with signs I'd never mastered, friend, hope, listen, a language I'd started too late but wouldn't stop learning now. I'd see Samuel sometimes, across the hall or in the yard, his head down, his hands still, but he was there, closer than he'd been in years, and I'd feel a flicker, not of triumph but of possibility, a thread I could hold onto. I practiced at night. My fingers stiff from years of labor, my wrists aching as I shaped words in the dim light of the apartment, the clock ticking behind me, the silence softer now, less a void and more a space we shared. I'd sign to him when he came home, school, tired, help, my gestures clumsy but earnest, my eyes searching his for a spark, for anything that said he saw me trying. He'd nod, sometimes, or sign back, yes, no later, his movements quick, his face still closed, but it was more than before, more than the shrugs, more than the wall, and I'd take it, my chest loosening with every small response. My hands steadier with every day I spent learning his world. I'd stop the radio, stop filling the quiet with noise he couldn't hear, and instead I'd sit with him, my presence a question he didn't have to answer, a bridge he didn't have to cross, but one I'd keep building anyway. The apartment felt different, not brighter but fuller, its emptiness less a judgment and more a canvas, a place where we could be without the weight of what we weren't. One night, I caught him laughing, a soundless thing that shook his shoulders, his head thrown back. His hand signing something I didn't catch, something he'd seen at school, something I hadn't given him but he'd found anyway. I'd been chopping vegetables, my knife pausing mid-cut, my eyes fixed on him, my breath held as I watched this boy, this stranger I'd raised, show me a piece of himself I'd never known. I signed funny what, tell me, my hands trembling, my heart racing, and he signed back. A quick flurry of fingers I couldn't follow, but it didn't matter, because he looked at me, his eyes meeting mine, his face open for the first time in years, and I laughed too. A quiet huff that matched his, a moment that wasn't loud but was ours. I'd lain awake after, the couch sagging beneath me, the ceiling a familiar map, and I'd felt it, acceptance, not of the silence, not of the struggle, but of us, of him as he was, of me as I could be. A mother who didn't need to fix him but could stand beside him in his world, in our world, together at last. A life that goes on the mornings had settled into something steady now, a rhythm that didn't chafe like it once did, a pattern etched into the days that felt less like a cage and more like a path, one I'd worn smooth with time. With steps I'd learned to take beside him rather than behind or ahead. I'd wake before the light breached the horizon, the apartment still cloaked in a darkness that wasn't heavy anymore, its edges softened by the years, by the quiet that had become ours. Not just his, not just mine, but something shared, something lived. The couch creaked as I rose, its springs groaning under me. A sound I'd grown to know like my own breath. And I'd moved to the kitchen, my hands finding the coffee pot by habit. Its gurgle filling the space with a hum that didn't need to compete with silence, didn't need to drown it out. I'd stand there, the steam curling up to warm my face, my eyes drifting to the window where Samuel used to sit, where he'd watched a world he couldn't hear, and I'd see it now, not as a barrier but as a frame, a view we'd both come to understand in our own way. Samuel was 15, his body long and lean, his face carrying a sharpness that reminded me of the boy he'd been but showed me the man he'd become, his hands quicker now. His eyes brighter, though still distant at times, still locked in a place I couldn't fully reach. He'd emerge from his corner, the curtain swaying as he stepped out, his hair tousled from sleep, his steps soft against the worn floor, and I'd watch him gather his things, school bag, jacket, a notebook he carried everywhere, its pages no longer hidden from me but not fully open either, a secret he'd let me glimpse but not hold. I'd sign morning, eat careful, my hands steady, my gestures smoother than they'd ever been. A language I'd carved into myself through years of trying, years of failing, years of starting again. He'd nod, his own hands flicking back, yes thanks, see you. A response that wasn't warm but wasn't cold. A thread that tied us together, thin but strong. A bond I'd stopped measuring by what it wasn't and started seeing for what it was. I'd pour the coffee, its bitterness sharp on my tongue, and I'd stand by the window as he left, my eyes following him down the street, his figure cutting through the early mist. His stride sure in a way it hadn't been before. A boy who'd found something out there. I couldn't give him but didn't need to anymore. The school for the deaf had become our anchor, not just mine, not just his but ours. A place where I worked, where he learned, where our worlds overlapped in ways they never had in the apartment's narrow walls. I'd spend my days there, my hands busy with papers or trays or chalk, my eyes catching him in the halls sometimes, his head bent over a desk or his fingers flashing with a friend. A sight that didn't erase the years of distance but softened them, smoothed their edges into something I could carry without breaking. I'd learned more than signs there, patience, presence, a way to be with him that didn't demand he change, didn't demand he hear, didn't demand he fit a mold I'd once thought he should. The apartment felt different when I came home, its bareness less stark, its silence less a void, its corners filled with traces of us. His sketches on the table, my coffee mug on the counter, a pair of shoes by the door that weren't mine. I'd cook now, not just for survival but for something else. Something small but real, meals with spices I'd started buying again. Flavors that reminded me of a life before. A life I could reclaim in pieces. He'd eat with me some nights, his fork moving slow, his eyes flicking up to mine, and I'd see it, a flicker of ease, a moment where the wall wasn't gone but wasn't all there was. A space where we could sit together, not speaking, not signing, just being. I'd stopped waiting for more, stopped chasing the boy I'd lost in his silence, and started seeing the one who'd grown through it. The one who'd found a way to live I hadn't taught him but could witness, could stand beside. Nights were quieter now, not empty but calm, a stillness that didn't press down but held us, a blanket we'd woven from years of struggle, years of reaching, years of letting go. I'd lie on the couch, my body sinking into its familiar dips, my eyes tracing the ceiling, its cracks a map I knew by heart, and I'd think of the hospital, of the window where it started, of the silence that had terrified me then, that had shaped me since. I'd think of Samuel's drawings, of the warehouse, of the school, of the laughter we'd shared, soundless but real, and I'd feel it. Not relief, not triumph, but something softer, something steady, a peace I hadn't known I could find. He'd sleep in his corner, his breathing a faint rhythm I didn't need to hear to feel, and I'd close my eyes, my hands resting on my chest, my mind still for once, not racing, not searching, just there. I'd smile sometimes, not because it was easy, not because the weight was gone, but because it wasn't mine alone anymore, because it was ours, carried together in a way I hadn't thought possible. The coffee cooled beside me, the city hummed beyond the walls, and I'd watch him go each morning, my eyes lingering as he faded into the distance. A boy who'd grown beyond me but not away. A son I'd raised in silence but found in it too. The day stretched on, hard still, simple still, but not hollow, not lost, and I'd stand by that window, my reflection faint in the glass, my breath steady, knowing this was our life, not loud, not whole, but ours, a quiet that didn't crush, a quiet that held us. A quiet that went on.